Okay. Hello, everyone. Well, welcome to the launch event for Carnegie's Digital Democracy Network. Uh, Carnegie's Digital Democracy Network is a diverse group of thinkers and activists engaged in work in technology and politics. And the network is dedicated to generating original analysis and enabling cross-regional knowledge sharing to fill critical research and policy gaps. Members of the network come from a diverse range of countries throughout the world, everywhere from Turkey and Argentina to Nigeria, South Africa, and Thailand. The current publication, which we are discussing today, New Digital Dilemmas, Resisting Autocrats, Navigating Geopolitics, Confronting Platforms, consists of 11 originally authored essays from network members. Now, essays within the volume are generally grouped into four themes. The first is how digital repression is shifting in different regions. So essays in that grouping look at evolving repression strategies in Iran and the Middle East, but also how civil society organizations are organizing in Southeast Asia to fight back against repressive states. The next group represents essays looking at the theme of digital sovereignty. And it really seeks to go beyond the kind of China digital sovereignty authoritarian dynamic that has been a major part of that conversation. Authors ask whether digital sovereignty can help get past power asymmetries, and they also ask us to more deeply examine the contradictions behind the concept of internet sovereignty, particularly viewed through an African lens. There also is an analysis of how countries can advance a vision of AI sovereignty, such as in Brazil. The third set of essays scrutinizes the interaction between platforms, digital rights, and transparency. One of the essays asks whether volume, speed, and accessibility, accelerated by information and communications technology, warrants a rethinking of legal principles related to free expression. Another essay warns that tech companies are becoming less transparent about how they handle requests for information, as well as censorship demands from governments. Finally, a last set of articles addresses geopolitical and governance questions linked to technology. One essay analyzes the UN's efforts to create a global digital compact. Another one asks, does responsible and democratic AI use stimulate development, or is AI development a precursor, enabling nations to subsequently adapt AI use to democratic norms? A final essay interrogates the conventional narrative that US export control policies is centered around geoeconomic considerations, while EU policy mostly focuses on protecting fundamental rights and actually flips that conception on its head. I'm joined by four of the essay authors today who will participate in a moderated conversation about the evolving role of digital technology in politics and society. I will introduce each of them in turn, and we'll have a conversation for the next 35 minutes or so. For the last 15 to 20 minutes, we'll open up the conversation to your questions. So please post them in the chat, and I hope we'll be able to get to them. So let me run through our speaker bios before we delve into our conversation. First is Mahsa Alimardani. She's been working within civil society for over a decade on projects related to access to the internet, especially in Iran. She is a senior researcher with the International Freedom of Expression Organization, Article 19, working on digital rights within the Middle East and North Africa region, and is also a senior information control fellow with the Open Technology Institute. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford's Oxford Internet Institute, where she is finishing a thesis on Iran's internet controls. Next, we have Arindrajit Basu, who is research lead at the Center for Internet and Society in India, where he focuses on the geopolitics and constitutionality of emerging technologies. He has held consulting positions on the same areas with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Diplomatic Risk Intelligence, and Association for Progressive Communications. He is a lawyer by training and holds a BA degree from the National University of Juridical Sciences in Kolkata and an LLM in Public International Law from the University of Cambridge. Third, we have Iginio Gagliardone, who is an associate professor in media and communications at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and an associate research fellow in new media and human rights in the program in comparative media law and policy in Oxford. He's the author of China, Africa, and the Future of the Internet, The Politics of Technology in Africa, and Countering Online Hate Speech. Last, we have Agustina Del Campo. She heads the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information at the University of Palermo in Argentina. The center provides legal technical analysis on cutting-edge free speech issues on and offline from a regional human rights perspective. Augustina teaches graduate and postgraduate courses on international human rights law and internet and human rights at the University of Palermo. She is a guest expert at Columbia's Global Freedom of Expression Project and an alternate member of the board at the Global Network Initiative. I'm really pleased that all four of you made time out of your busy schedules to join us from many different corners of the world. And I really look forward to the ensuing conversation. And just before we go in, I really hope that all of you will have a chance to look at and read our collection of essays here. So Mahsa, let's start with you. Gender and how women behave in Iran are at the heart of the protests. In what ways is the regime aiming particular tactics of digital repression at women or affecting them differently in Iran?
I mean, this requires us to look at what's been happening in Iran over the past year. So there was this really incredible movement sparked by the murder in custody of Mahsa Amini for not wearing her hijab properly in the Islamic Republic of Iran that has extremely discriminatory laws against women and forces mandatory hijab on them. And so this kind of sparked this uprising across Iran. And the symbol and catalyst of it was women's rights and the right that women have to choose whether or not to wear hijab and how they appear in public spaces in Iran. And because this was the catalyst, this also became kind of part of the cultural revolution, which was, you had 4 decades. Well, we still have 4 decades of the Islamic Republic's authoritarian rule over Iranian people. And one of the greatest symbols has been this enforcement of mandatory hijab. It's been one of the greatest, symbols of their authoritarian rule. And, the protesters were not necessarily successful in toppling the Islamic Republic, which was ultimately what people were saying on the streets. But what has really been the lasting legacy has been this social and cultural revolution where women really pushed back against the control of the state and showed that they no longer had fear. Even to this very day, on the streets of Iran, people report that brave women, even as they're being patrolled by morality police and armed militiamen on the streets, they're still taking off their hijabs and facing this enormous risk of torture, beatings, arrests, etc. And this shift of this incredible bravery of Iranian women really has been elevated by social media, and the fact that it's been able to make these images of defiant, brave Iranian women taking off their hijab or just leading their ordinary lives without hijab go viral has been part of this. And trying to really censor and ensure that these powerful images, that the power of social media to really create this shift in society in Iran, and to not only mobilize protests, but mobilize everyday defiance has been really part of what they've been trying to do to bring back, that level of fear. And we've been seeing this through multiple different facets of creating these very new aggressive laws that criminalize women sharing images of themselves without hijab, trying to censor and intimidate folks with, taking away phones or searching phones, intimidating them online. So this has been a massive part of this form of control. And of course, we had seen these very harrowing tactics of shutdowns and disabling VPNs and all of these different things that was part of the fabric of putting down the mobilization of the protests. And it continues to this very day. But really, the strongest element of this has been, and in some ways kind of unsuccessfully, their efforts to really censor Iranian women and put them back into their places, to say in some ways, and to ensure that these powerful images don't continue to dominate, the hearts and minds of Iranians, and in some ways globally, when the focus is sometimes on Iran.
Thank you. Wow, that's really powerful, and I want to delve more into that a little later. I think one thing that strikes me is that there is both such a power to showing the symbols of the hijabs being taken off, but also such a vulnerability associated with social media images like that go viral, with the regime being able to then identify and target those very women who are taking such a symbolic stand against the regime's strictures, and sort of balancing the kind of costs and benefits of that, I think, can be a really difficult thing, and comes at a tremendous personal cost. So something really worth thinking about. I'm going to turn next to Arindrajit, and I realized that I actually read a slightly older version of his bio. So let me quickly update that, and that's really my mistake. So Arindrajit is a PhD candidate currently at Leiden University's Faculty of Global Governance and Affairs. His dissertation aims to map and evaluate how states and non-state actors use the language and rhetoric of sovereignty across multilateral cyber negotiations. Before that, he was a research lead at the Center for Internet and Society in India, where he published on tech geopolitics and data governance issues in India. So, with that updated bio, let's proceed. So, Arindrajit, you write how sovereignty can be used to consolidate state control for repressive purposes, as well as to be used as a means to push back against global power asymmetries. So for me, I guess the question is, how can we ensure that the digital sovereignty concept isn't co-opted for authoritarian purposes rather than used for the public benefit that you so eloquently described in your essay?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks first of all for sharing both my previous and kind of present life. So that's much appreciated. I think the answer actually lies in power, and you already used the word in your question. But let me explain how, and that is kind of the central theme throughout my essay. It is about how rhetoric can be used to unshackle power asymmetries, the power of language and the power of rhetoric. And let me explain that in my response. So the first idea is that sovereignty historically has always been a malleable concept. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so durable in political discourse. So what I kind of caution against is to take a very strictly legal approach to sovereignty, where you define it or you limit the understanding based on, say, the Montevideo Convention, or based only on territorial borders, and to actually look at the power of using sovereignty as a linguistic tool. And that is exactly what we should use to distinguish between what are nefarious uses of sovereignty and what are positive uses of sovereignty, which is what I encourage. So essentially, and I think everyone knows this, but the origins of sovereignty actually came from kind of the colonizers of the medieval age, where the argument or the rhetoric was used to say that indigenous communities don't assert property rights, or they don't assert sovereignty in the same way that kind of erstwhile colonizers did. And that was the justification used to essentially deprive individuals and communities of rights, of dignity, and of power, most importantly of power. And then in the post-colonial world, sovereignty was almost reclaimed in a sense to fight for the rights of these post-colonial states and reassert power over resources, power over how the global kind of governance was run. And in some senses, the internet is something that can empower, of course, because of its borderless nature. But the borderless nature of the internet is what also often leads to issues that we're facing today, such as companies kind of, again, the new rhetoric of colonization today. So with that background, I think what we need to look for is, one, who is using that rhetoric and why are they using it? And so an example that I use in the essay is China's use of the information sovereignty rhetoric to essentially create a great firewall. And that is clearly used by the powerful, being used by the state to essentially reduce the rights of citizens, to reduce the amount of exposure they have to global information. And it's clearly a nefarious use of digital sovereignty or information sovereignty, at least the way I would see it. But at the same time, the same rhetoric, sovereignty, is being used by indigenous communities in New Zealand. It is being used by workers' collectives around the world, especially in Brazil, to say that, to use it essentially as a metaphor or in many ways a synonym for autonomy, to say that communities also have sovereignty. So while this rhetoric is not in line with the state-centric notion of sovereignty that we are more used to in IR scholarship or in legal scholarship, the fact is that these communities are able to reclaim this language to challenge the power that states or companies have. And that is very clearly a positive use, I would say, of sovereignty, because there isn't any other tool that is as useful to actually assert those claims. Human rights is definitely a tool, but it does not necessarily work in all cases to assert the kinds of claims that communities may have over data. And consequently, sovereignty may be integral for non-state communities and also states in some cases to assert themselves. There are obviously certain gray areas as well where the answer may not be so obvious. Sovereignty claims through data localization is an example, and for that we may need to look beyond the rhetoric and look at what the actual policy issues are. Why are some countries looking to localize more data? The European Union does it to ostensibly support and safeguard the rights of citizens. Other countries may be doing it to maybe challenge present internet structures where access to data is not so easy. But there are in some certain cases gray areas where we need to get to the bottom of the policy discourse. So to sum up, it's rhetoric. It could be powerful rhetoric, but it is definitely nefarious when a powerful actor such as a state uses it to clamp down on the rights of citizens. Definitely more positive and in good faith when there are communities using it to rise up against the power of companies and states alike. So let me stop there and maybe we can discuss this further.
That's great. No, I think that's a really important point that you make, that the idea is that, that to reclaim the rhetoric of sovereignty, that's not one that belongs simply to the powerful, whether we're talking about Western states or whether we're talking about states, in the global South that are using that as a means to consolidate their power, that it belongs to a wider array of stakeholders and communities and should be considered as such. So I think that to me represents the onset of an important dialogue on this issue that I hope gets more traction. So sticking with the issue of sovereignty, let me turn to Iginio and ask, because you also write about sovereignty as well in your essay, do you see room for a version of the internet that defies both the Chinese sovereign internet model, which we were just talking about, as well as a US internet freedom model dominated by Western companies? What might an internet that is compatible with the contradictions of the African colonial experience look like?
Well, I think so far the default position has been, looking at the map of Africa to sort of color authoritarian regime and place them into the sphere of influence of China, and then doing the opposite with the more open and democratic. The usual one are like Kenya and Ghana for the more open regimes, and then maybe looking at Ethiopia, Sudan, and this has the problem of creating division among African countries that actually don't exist. Africa has been historically known as a place of conflict, but conflict has almost never emerged between countries. It has emerged within countries, also in this case as a consequence of how the borders were drawn during colonialism. And there is another opportunity here. And we were having this very interesting conversation just before we started, we went live, about how we have to be strategic and to be attuned at the different histories of different regions. Pan-Africanism was a very strong movement in the 1960s and 1970s. And the reason why colonial borders were kept as they are was a tactical move, and saying as we gain sovereignty, as we become nation state, it will destroy the whole continent if we were trying to redraw the borders, even if we know that these borders were just cutting across communities that thought of themselves as one for decades or for centuries. But I think at the same time we have to reclaim that opportunity, even if Pan-Africanism is sort of on the demise, especially in the political space when it comes about governance. And my colleague at Witzer Schillenbem says that there's been after decolonization, and there's been a fetishization of the nation state. The nation state was an imposition. It came with armies, it came with violence, it came with blood, and it's a paradox if we think about it. That so decades after the process of decolonization, a lot of governments, less so people, have become so attached to these impositions that came with force. And in Africa, there are also some practical example about how technology was seized to redraw some of those borders. Very few people know it, but the first area across nation state without roaming was actually in Africa. It was created by Mo Ibrahim Celta when he created this one network using some loophole at the very beginning, where new technologies were seen as too new for legislators to sort of regulate them. And he allowed people in across Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya to just travel across borders and not having to switch to SIM cards. It's something that the European Union achieved 10 years later, 10 years after Africa had done that already. So I think we have to reclaim that space, and it's sort of a necessity. We had, again, in the conversation we just had, India doesn't need to network without a space to be heard. It's big enough. And the amount of resources, the amount of money that can be made by different platforms is massive if we look at just one country. Africa is different. Nigeria is growing fast. It's going to become one of
I think we may have just lost the last portion of what Iginio was saying. So we'll go next, and then we'll turn back to Iginio when he comes back online. I do want to say, fascinating what he was mentioning, and it does raise to me the kind of this discrepancy, which in part is also something Arindrajit was mentioning as well, between states and citizens. And it strikes me that in the Africa context, things, especially on the sort of democracy front, if you look at the kind of spate of coups that have occurred in West Africa, in Central Africa, kind of growing instances of conflict in places like Ethiopia, Sudan, and so forth, that on the one hand, the governance structures really are kind of pointing towards a continued sort of reassertion of sovereignty backed by violence. On the other hand, I don't think that's necessarily in sync with maybe popular sentiment about kind of promoting more of a kind of Pan-African conception of sovereignty. And I think that widening gap to me is really concerning in terms of where governance is going on the one hand, and potentially where people's interests and sentiments actually do lie. So more to discuss on that front. But let me turn and pivot slightly off digital sovereignty to Agustina. So in your fascinating piece, you describe a tension between traditional freedom of expression protections and new considerations regarding harmful but legal speech that are becoming turbocharged due to the volume, scale, and speed in which content now spreads. Can you talk further about this tension and why it's become such a contentious issue?
Hi, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. So this essay is a piece, a sort of starting conceptualizing piece of a bigger research that we're doing, and it sparks from looking at the legislative observatory that CELE, the organization I direct, runs in the region and has been running for a while now. It's been looking at bills of law and at the legislation that's coming out of the region and how they are dealing with new freedom of expression issues, particularly how they are dealing with new digital freedom of expression issues. And we've, in looking at that bulk of information, and also contrasting it with international legislative trends, looking at what's happening and what kinds of bills are being proposed in Europe, what kinds of reforms are being proposed to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, how are different communities, legal communities particularly, thinking about changes to digital freedom of expression as it evolves. It became pretty clear to us that most of the initiatives that we were seeing were incompatible with freedom of expression standards. So that's a first conclusion that is not shocking, but very worrying when you see the last 5-6 years of legislation being proposed that is incompatible with international freedom of expression standards, it's incompatible with regional freedom of expression standards, you start wondering what's happening. Are states, are people drifting away from the freedom of expression standard that we currently have, or are we dealing with issues that are new? And that is the approach that we're taking here. And this essay basically argues that the underlying issue that most of these bills and laws have in common is an inability to deal with speed, volume, and permanence of speech online. And those features were pretty much brought by the internet. Before this time, if you wanted to access past information, you probably had to visit a library, you probably had to dig into a research, go into archives. It wasn't easily accessible. If you wanted to reach a broad audience, you had to put money into it. You had to articulate, you had to organize. There were a number of intermediaries that you had to go through in order for your content to actually reach a broad audience. If you wanted to speak across borders, those difficulties were even higher. If people wanted to share other people's opinions or thoughts or whatever, they had to do it orally, basically, because they couldn't just cut and paste the content and circulate it within their own networks like we do now. So the essay proposes that some of the hardest issues that we have seen coming up in content governance debates are related to this. So when you look at harmful but legal speech, most of the times you're talking about speech that individually would not reach the threshold for illegal content, for content that you should be held liable for. But when put in a context of virality, of permanence, if you think about the right to be forgotten, for example, so if you think about a content that's going to survive in relevance for the next 20 years, 25 years, and it's going to be the first content that comes up in a search 20 years after the fact, well, you're probably looking at information that is perfectly legitimate, that is probably not leading to any individual liability whatsoever, because there is no infringement on other people's rights, because it's from the point of view of freedom of expression, the content is legitimate. So that's the argument that I'm making on the essay, and it's the argument that I'm developing in my research. So if we want to keep promoting these kinds of legislations that address new issues, well, we need to either see if we want to keep our freedom of expression standards as they are, or we need to acknowledge that there needs to be a conversation about legally how to overcome this new paradigm.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that you really laid it out very well. And I think one of the problems that I see is that there's sort of two communities talking past one another, where you have a community focused on disinformation and public safety that is and oftentimes with very legitimate objectives, in Europe and other places that very much is calling for greater controls and not necessarily for authoritarian purposes at all. And then on the other hand, you have a free speech community that says, look, these are fundamental rights and you can't just change them without having a very deliberate, conscious process about what you're trying to do. And rather than have the two communities come together and try to hash it out, I feel like each one is kind of speaking to its own stakeholders. And so I feel like we're a little bit stuck. I don't feel like we've actually being able to move past that. And I think one of the important things that your essay does is sort of frame the issue more broadly and hopefully usher in an important conversation on that front. So I look forward to seeing more of what you research, but I do think more broadly, I hope that people within the community find ways to kind of work through some of these really thorny, tricky problems on this front. So one thing I want to kind of maybe raise for the broader group, and something that has been kind of on the top of mind for policymakers when it comes to their agenda, has been kind of new emerging technologies, particularly when it comes to AI tools and generative AI. And there's been a lot of speculation and I think some growing anxiety about the potential uses for these tools, both in terms of potentially undermining democracies, as well as sort of serving as a means for authoritarian enhancement. And so I would be curious to kind of hear from each of you, sort of what do you see when you think of kind of new tools that are coming online or new evolving tactics that are there? How does that relate to your own conceptions of what you've been talking about and writing about within this volume? So, for example, if we turn to Mahsa for a second, we're sort of on the brink of two things, it seems to me, in Iran. On the one hand, there has been a reliance on kind of tools of control and isolation, which is not at all new in terms of other models that we've seen from an authoritarian lens. And yet we're also at a point right now where some of these new tools potentially could have significant effects when it comes to furthering social control and trying to undermine protests and other demonstrations of independence in the country. What would your thoughts be about what we can anticipate or what we're seeing going forward?
Yeah, I mean, before I answer that, I'd love to touch on just what my colleagues in the network have been saying before. And I don't know if it's been said just how complementary I think a lot of our work is. And I think when I look at how I'm working on Iran and information controls there, I often touch on a lot of the different topics and intersections of internet scholarship and discourse between everyone here in terms of obviously looking at internet sovereignty and how that's defining what's going on in the policies in Iran, and then looking at how the limits of freedom of expression and how it's legislated and defined in terms of content moderation is also impacting information controls. And then now moving on to AI, and I think it's a credit to you, Stephen, for bringing all of us together who are working on all these separate issues in such a complementary way. And I mean, I often end up working on a lot of these different fields, touching on misinformation and disinformation, and then content moderation, and then looking at these different systems of authoritarian control, or however Arindrajit defines internet sovereignty or those systems. But yeah, this is really the new frontier, and it is really becoming, I guess, this new and trendy topic to discuss how authoritarian control and AI is really defining the future. And I mean, we can't deny it. It is really going to create a new frontier of everything. We're talking about misinformation and disinformation in the context of Iran, and we're talking about the progress of internet censorship, and all of this is going to be, just exasperated with the evolution of AI within these different systems. And we already were seeing it with the sophisticated kind of deep packet inspection and methods the Islamic Republic was using to go after aggressively new protocols of VPNs, which we know has been incorporating some of these new technologies. And of course, we have this concept of facial recognition and AI tools and how it's going to be used to police women as this new frontier of control. And it is, I mean, in my essay, I try to unpack this a little bit, which is the kind of discussion and how kind of frightening and how buzzwordy these topics are is really adding to the kinds of controls that they want, which is, the announcements and propaganda campaigns the regime is using that they do have these technologies is supposed to induce fear to kind of get, as I was talking about, getting women to get back in line and go back to the pre-Mahsa Amini phase of being afraid. So being afraid of the fact that these very aggressive and sophisticated technologies are watching them. And so even if we try to unpack it, it's really uncertain what kind of levels of sophistication the technology has. But the fact that the news articles, the announcements, and the fear of this is getting all of this attention is really having an impact on society. It is having an impact on the psyche of folks who, you know, are choosing whether or not to defy the laws and you know, perform their everyday kind of protests. But that's not to say that this isn't coming, that the sophistication and aggressiveness isn't on, you know, there is evidence to show that it's happening and that regimes like the Islamic Republic are moving towards these systems. I mean, one kind of saving grace that we have with regimes like the Islamic Republic, and I'm sure we find this in Russia and other contexts that have such aggressive online controls, is that there's so much corruption and so much state mismanagement that there's always the hope that, you know, there is some kind of mismanagement happening to make the tools less sophisticated. And this is what a lot of folks are saying about this rollout of AI facial recognition to police women in the context of Iran, because they have had previous projects for internet control rolled out. And there have been retrospectives, even from government officials who are criticizing each other in the Islamic Republic, who say, well, it seems like you spent $50 million on this intelligent filtering project that came to nothing. And there's no kind of result from this, this work. And so this has happened often. So again, yeah, we are moving towards it, but there is some, I guess, exasperation of what the reality might be as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you know, you raise a really interesting point that, you know, and I think it's something that I'd be curious to get other perspectives on as well. But you know, part of the fear with these new advanced technologies, with facial recognition, AI algorithms, is as much just the speculative potential of what it could do, the intimidation of something that is unknown and has seemingly unlimited capabilities, as opposed to the actual capacities in terms of how these systems are used and what effect they have. And you know, I mean, I sometimes wonder or worry that is the community in danger of kind of falling into you know, a little bit of a trap when it comes to sort of becoming overly deterministic about these technologies. Iran has imported X system from China. It will now be able to perfectly implement social control. Facial recognition will be a fact of life across all the streets. No one will have any privacy whatsoever. I mean, there are lots of bureaucratic reasons and capacity reasons why issues like that become very complicated in practice to implement. And that rather than sort of say, we have now moved from you know, X to Y in terms of kind of complete social control, maybe we need to be a little more critical and scrutinize what effects technologies will actually have, as opposed to just sort of leaping ahead and assuming that they will be kind of all knowing and all powerful. I'd be curious to get other perspectives on this.
I can jump in if the connection stays with me, as you know, I've frozen a number of times. And here in South Africa, we have what is called load shedding, which is a euphemism for a planned blackout, which, you know, very analog kind of issue. But so I want to go back to the issue of failure. And I think there is a strange cooperation between those looking from you know, the US and Europe at what China is doing in Africa. There is a number of articles with very sensationalistic headlines that the Panopticon is already here responding to Huawei deploying safe city and smart city solution. And in reality, and of course, also Huawei as a company promoting the idea that their solution is very successful. And one of the reasons also because they've tried and tested in China. But often when they are deployed in an African context, and there are also some research in Pakistan, they fail quite miserably. And I think the research on failure, why things fail, it's missing in a lot of these debates. On the one hand, it's obvious is a kind of gadgetism sometimes when you think about technology. And these are very complex socio-technical systems that the social norms in Mombasa or in Kenya are very different from the social norms in Shenzhen. So what is accepted there, the ability of the state to respond is dramatically different. And often there is this kind of shallow way to read the technologies of freedom as this kind of juggernaut that is going to end up on people's life and on people's bodies. And as much as, unfortunately, liberation technology of freedom have failed to deliver what they were expected to deliver, also technology of freedom failed. That doesn't mean that we don't have to develop tools to see what are the dangers around there. But I think a more systematic, almost ethnographic understanding of how this technology is deployed, what it does to a community, it's completely missing, and we tend to let geopolitics run its course in ways that I think are deceiving rather than revealing, and much more is needed in that direction.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I remember vividly reading your most recent book, China, Africa, and the Future of the Internet, and really thinking through your arguments. I think I was actually reading it on my way back from Ethiopia when I was doing a case study for my own book, and it sort of just clicked for me. I said, wait a second, this is exactly the right type of analysis, that we are jumping ahead and creating these narratives about the effect of certain systems without actually doing the empirical work on the ground to understand better how these systems are working, effectively or not. Along those lines, I'm curious, Augustina, to get your viewpoint. We've been talking about very real changes that ICT has brought when it comes to content and the spread of content. And now with generative AI in particular, there's a real fear that this will get supercharged even more, as well as micro-targeted to individuals. And, I think that, sometimes the sort of hype machine goes into overdrive on that front. And that people start to assume the very worst when it comes to the inability for individuals to think freely or independently in the very near future. And I have some skepticism whether that will particularly come about. At the same time, I think it would be remiss to not kind of at least consider what kind of changes will happen, because given how much ICT has changed things so much when it comes to communication. So I'm curious, as you think about these differing conceptions, where do you stand when it comes to the onset of these new technologies on expression?
So a big plus one to Mahsa and to Iginio's comments. I think there's a lack of empirical evidence about a lot of what we discuss under this very broad umbrella category of artificial intelligence and algorithms. I think the conversation is being packed very conveniently. What is it that we're concerned about? I think when you think about it from a legal perspective and when you think about it from a policy perspective, it's rather different whether you approach the issue as from the perspective of rights than when you approach the issue from the perspective of risks. I think those two approaches are, in my mind, very different. I think right now the conversation is being approached from a risk perspective rather than from a rights perspective. And that, to me, is concerning. The second point that I would make is this a freedom of expression issue? A lot of times when discussing AI and algorithms, we tend to think that everything related to that is a freedom of expression issue, and it's the same freedom of expression issue, and the same actors should be involved in the same ways. I remember discussing this with you, I think, in relation to my essay. Is it the same thing whether the state uses the technology than whether a private company uses the technology? Is it the same thing whether a foreign state uses the technology or if it's your own state using the technology? And in my mind, the answer is every single scenario is a different scenario. If it's your state and within its citizens, it's one issue, it's a human rights issue, and it can be approached from the different human rights angle. If it's a foreign state and it's acting outside of its territory, it's probably an international law issue rather than a human rights, a purely human rights issue. And you have other concerns there that shouldn't be addressed exclusively from the same angle than you address the others. When it's a company using these technologies, then you have a different legal framework where you need to address it from, and you have different obligations that are incumbent within the problem. So I think a first step in safeguarding freedom of expression while we navigate this conversation is unpacking the issue and try to break it down. What are the ethical concerns that we have? What are the legal concerns that we have? And from which area of the law, for which rights are we concerned about? Which rights does it promote? And how do we articulate that conversation from the different buckets rather than try to address it from a single AI, new technology development, unique conversation?
Yeah, very well put. I think that's there is so much of a tendency just to kind of lump it all together and try to divine a single answer. And I think you're right. The nuances matter, the actors matter, the motivations matter, and to understand those variances is, I think, a really important part of coming up with a a grounded analysis. I want to turn to Arindrajit, and I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is that, and this relates in part to a question that was asked in the chat. About generative AI seemingly dominated by U.S. tech firms at the moment, and what this will mean for conversations around internet sovereignty. And so, I think even broadening that out slightly, Arindrajit, we talked a lot about states and how they are using kind of the rhetoric of internet sovereignty in one certain way. And we talked a little bit about how other communities are trying to kind of reclaim internet sovereignty. But what about the role of private companies, which are transnational, governed by profit motives, and certainly claim a lot of power? How do you see that dynamic fitting into your own kind of evolving analysis of internet sovereignty?
Yeah, I think great question, and thanks for the question in the chat as well. I think couple of things. One is that the statement generative AI power is dominated by US tech firms is accurate, but that's true for any internet infrastructure. I'm using the word infrastructure broadly. It's dominated by firms, in the US, to a certain extent China. I think that something that's different in today's moment when it comes to private companies and including those working on generative AI is that when the internet originated in the 1990s broadly, I think the overarching dominant ideology at the time was the laissez-faire ideology, and the fact that regulation and assertion of sovereign power through regulation is something that is antithetical to the core values of the internet. So John Perry Barlow and the initial thinkers on the internet, and that has evolved today to maybe, as we were discussing, maybe the opposite end of the spectrum, where there's maybe a hype cycle criticizing technology too much. But we are definitely in a moment where the world, whether it is at the political level through AI summits, whether it is academia and civil society, where world over we recognize that technology is something that could be harnessed for good, but comes with real potential costs. And I think this applies to generative AI as well. So while it is, of course, dominated by US technology companies, I think the kind of castigation and bashing of sovereignty and assertion of sovereign control that happened in the 1990s is, I think we're in a very different moment today where every country, accepts that some degree of regulation is required, including private sector companies. So again, in terms of what the role of private sector companies, I think again that can be answered by looking at power. Of course, in many ways, one could argue that private sector companies are able to take on what were traditionally essentially sovereign functions. So moderating speech and moderating speech online is essentially a sovereign function which states accept they don't have the capability to do in certain cases and kind of delegate that to the private sector. So it's about how the private sector responds to that. Again, there are some requests that are nefarious, some requests that force content takedown in a manner that is antithetical to human rights, and certain requests that are legitimate, where, say, violence against women speech that, or hate speech against certain communities, that needs to be taken down. So it's about how the private sector responds to states and how they work with states in terms of discerning what is a legitimate request in terms of its alignment with understanding of human rights and what is not. The second major, I think, role for the private sector is how and the extent to which they want to be a responsible stakeholder in global conversations. And that is in many ways determined by how closely they work with civil society. And there are multiple examples of how the private sector is genuinely working with civil society to come up with functions or rules of the road that are fairer. And there are also cases where you could argue the kind of private sector civil society connection is ethics washing and kind of just like basically providing a fig leaf for that profit motive. But what I think increasingly is happening, and this is back to my first point, is that there is public awareness at the political level and at the industry leadership level, where the private sector's profit motive is directly tied to how responsible it is on issues of regulation. Privacy is, of course, a big one, and Apple's shift on that has been, kind of something to note. But I think that increasingly the public across the world is aware of the responsibility of the private sector and being a responsible actor that, of course, reacts to states in a manner that is in line with legitimate sovereign requests but balances human rights, and at the same time plays the role of a responsible stakeholder in global governance conversations, including those happening on AI. I think that is something that the public recognizes as something that is positive and consequently does reward or has at least the ability to punish private sector actors on that front. And that's, of course, I'm not saying that the kind of networked entrenchment that especially social media platforms have is something that can be overcome only through public participation, but it's definitely something that is being increasingly tied to profit margins. And the more that the responsibility can be tied to profit margins is what I think kind of enables a fairer and more democratic internet going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an interesting way to put it. I think there remains kind of a fundamental challenge when it comes to the kind of structural asymmetries baked in when you have profit-seeking companies that are in such control over moderating who can say what, and really being able to dictate to some degree political outcomes. And regardless of their responsiveness, it does, I think, to me, continue to raise the question about whether that type of model works in the long time, whether that's sustainable, or whether we need to seek and try to advance other models, more kind of like Wikipedia type of models that are not beholden to sovereign governments, that are not beholden to shareholders, but are beholden to a community of stakeholders. So just something amusing for me. I want to ask Mahsa and Iginio that we have a question about digital public infrastructure and its role in solving global issues. And by digital public infrastructure, we're talking about different types of, essentially public sector run initiatives like Aadhaar, the digital ID initiative in India is a case in point, but there are many others that are proliferating around the world. It's become a really big issue on the governance map. And I particularly am interested to hear both your perspectives. I would think, Mahsa, that given that you study the predations of the Iranian state, that the idea of DPI being something that would be promoted, at least in Iran, might be of concern. Iginio, throughout the African context, DPI has become something that is talked about in a variety of contexts, some, I think, repressive, some not. So I'd also be curious to kind of hear your perspective on how to manage DPI, what's good, what's concerning from your end. So maybe start with Mahsa and then Iginio.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. With the Islamic Republic, I think it's just such a strange state in terms of the economic model it's built on. I guess the most really comparable might be Russia in terms of it kind of being this Islamic theocracy, but it operates like an oligarchy, and they are really interested in centralized control, but it's still very much operates as a capitalist oligarchy in that they want a lot of private ownership of infrastructure, especially telecommunications infrastructure, but that private ownership has to be within the select few oligarchs that are tied to the state. And so we've seen this very often, that private holdings of the Revolutionary Guards own much of the telecommunications infrastructure and companies. And in fact, a lot of the private sector in IT is in some ways directly or indirectly controlled by institutions of the state. So this concept, I think, is quite complicated within this context of, you know, not really having clear definitions of what public and private are. And so the concept, I guess, of digital public infrastructure really should be redefined in this context of centralized governance, because often we do have very much the proliferation of private telecommunications companies and decentralized nature of ISPs exists within Iran, but the centralization and licensing of the whole process very much makes it a state operation. So I wouldn't necessarily call it digital public infrastructure. I would call it digital centralized infrastructure, if anything, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
Stephen, if you let me, I'm gonna roll back to the previous question, but in a way that ties later to the DPI one.
Absolutely.
So about responsibility and the imbalances of power between big tech and countries, you know, at the margins in a way, or countries in the global south. Because one of the issues is a lot of these big tech, let's think about Meta and Twitter X and so forth, claim a right to interference without responsibility. And it came very clearly with the Francis Haugen revelation. So we interfere in a country's politics and we don't take responsibility for it. And we don't put the resources in order to deal with that issue. And this has caused quite a lot of anger in states, and then ties to the sovereignty issue. And in some cases, this has been done in ways that have the face of an authoritarian leader that overstayed his time in office in the 80s and 90s, and you know, who is not listened to, but whose politics matter. And in other cases, I think is quite interesting. It's a new forms of protest. Is the case in Kenya of a company, Sama, that outsourced the content moderation for Facebook, but also for OpenAI. And the employers in trying to sue Sama, and there are larger companies outsourcing work to them in ways that say we now suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's the global south that is sort of becoming more vocal, sometimes as the face of a dictator, but sometimes the face of labor. And I think labor and rights, there's also an element of risk, is a new interesting dimension. And this also ties to some, I'm not an expert of digital public infrastructure, sometimes an opportunity for a little bit of, I don't know which kind of washing it is, you know, the private that sort of knows that is under attack and wants to do the right thing. And so I would be a bit aware of it. Of course, there are standards in defining what can be said as a digital public infrastructure. But to be provocative, I will get the money from the private sector and some of the issues from the public sector, and then I will let the techies in the civil society run the whole thing, as it was going back to John Perry Barlow idea. So if you take it seriously, give it in the hands of the techie, and we will run the show with your money and with your mandate. You know, good governance is something that can be done, but those actors have to be outside of the picture. Other people should do the job.
Great. Well, thank you. I do like your sort of provocative ending point, Iginio, and in part that kind of borrows a little bit from the provocation I put right before that in terms of trying to find new models. I think I do think we have to kind of think beyond the status quo and not be satisfied with it, given all the problems and questions and concerns that we've raised. We could go on for another couple hours. This has been fascinating for me. Hopefully, you all have enjoyed it as well, both the panelists here and the wider audience. Thank you for your time. Thanks to the viewers for watching. Please, log on and take a look at this collection of essays. It's going to be found online at carnegie.org. And, I hope we can continue the conversation in the coming weeks and months on these very important issues. So thank you again, and we'll talk soon.